Hello, I'm Stephen Coates, and this is the Bureau of Lost Culture. I'm standing on a road in north-east London, Balls Pond Road to be precise. I used to travel down this road on the bus when I was seeing somebody in Dalston back in the day. But I'm sure you're not interested in the geography of my romantic past. I came here to look at a house number 99. It's a rather modest, typical London mid-terrace from the late 19th century, I guess. And this part of London, this street actually, has gone through lots of changes. It was once genteel, then it was down at heel, and now it's on its way up again. You can tell by the number of estate agent signs. The house itself is still quite scruffy. It's hidden by a large bush, and there's absolutely no sign of the exciting things that happened here in the years 1967 and 1968. Deep in the heart of swinging countercultural London, when it was occupied by an experimental theatre and arts group called the Exploding Galaxy. And that's the subject of this episode of the Bureau of Lost Culture, with author JILL DROWER, who spent some of her formative years as part of the Exploding Galaxy troupe in this house and has written an extraordinary book about it. We're also going to dig deep into the psychedelic happenings at the UFO Club, at the 14-hour Technicolour Dream event, kinetic art, getting busted by dodgy police officers planting weed, and what it was like to be young and witness all this crazy shit happening around you. For more of our crazy shit, check out all that we do at bureauoflostculture.com, where you can join us, contact us, support our wild endeavours. In the meantime, let's head back to the studio to meet Jill and my co-conspirator, Kev Folks, DJ Food. The Exploding Galaxy was a living multimedia art form, a collective of artists, musicians, poets and dancers who shared a creative spirit that defied the boundaries between art and life. This experimental dance drama group lived as a community at 99 Balls Pond Road in North London from early 1967 until it disbanded at the end of 1968. And our guest today was an exploder.
Right, yes.
JILL DROWER. Hello, yes. Jill. And my co-countercultural host, Strictly Kev, DJ Food. Hello, Kev.
Hi there.
And I must confess, Kev actually turned me on, as it were, to JILL DROWER's book, The Exploding Galaxy, which is amazing. And I'll also mention the fact that if you check out Kev's website, djfood.org, you'll see the amazing countercultural artwork that he's been posting from.
Yes, I've been combing the archives for flyers, posters, for things like Middle Earth, UFO, and all sorts of other interesting countercultural publications.
I think UFO is going to feature in this story, yes. Right?
Well,
fairly
talking
heavily.
Of posters, I used to go around UFO and the LSE and everywhere they had gigs and take the posters down. I had Plant a Flower Child, and I had Games for May, which was a Pink Floyd one, which I'd taken off the walls. I betrayed my hippie roots by ringing up an auction house and asking how much I could sell this poster for.
I want to back up the truck a bit because
yes.
We're going to be talking about the Exploding Galaxy, and I did a little intro about it there, and Kev's got a whole list of questions for you, Jill, which we're going to go through, because you tell us, from your point of view, what was the Exploding Galaxy? How did you come to it?
Well, I suppose you have to go back to UFO, this UFO being the nightclub that was the Flower Children's favourite nightclub in London in the 60s. And it was there that I met David Medalla, who was an artist, kinetic artist, and his gallery had gone bust.
That was Signals, right?
That was Signals.
In Wigmore Street.
That's the one. And it was a very innovative gallery, but it did go under because no one wanted to buy kinetic artworks at that time. Of course, they're all now in major museums.
So I'm going to stop you there because I need to understand what a few of these terms are. What's a kinetic artwork?
Kinetic artwork is an artwork that has movement involved in it somehow. So, for example, if you take something like Bridget Riley, I would say that I would describe that as kinetic because it's got a sort of op art feel. There's a movement, moire and all of that. So that's one kind of kinetic artwork, well, under my definition. The others were items that had a motor attached, and or it may have been gravity or a magnet that made them move. So you have the artist Takis, who had he used old industrial magnets, and you'd have a pendulum and it would hang down and it'd make a humming noise and reverberation, and then it would swing in random ways. And of course the hippies adored anything to do with random. So this gallery showed people like that, including David Madalla, who went on to start the Exploding Galaxy. So,
and he had the bubble machines, didn't he? That was one of his big things.
His was there was a motor with some boxes and a hole at the top, and soap would sort of spill. I wouldn't say it spilt; it sort of folded out over itself, and they were called cloud canyons because that's how they looked. And it was all again, it was random. So whatever shape you might, there was a photographer who used to come and photograph the bubble machines, and he'd be absolutely surprised at how different each photograph was with the foam folds, I suppose you'd call them. Anyway, so there was a strong connection with the Signals Art Gallery. There was a very strong connection with this club that had just opened up in London. And there was also the element of LSD, which, although most of us hadn't taken it at that point, was it changed the way you looked at the world quite a bit. And I think that has to be added in as one of the contributing factors to how the Exploding Galaxy developed over the next 2 years.
How old were you?
It sounds shocking. I was 15.
And you were from Putney?
I was from Putney, and
Posh
I went to Putney High School even. So, but I was also in a folk group at that time. So from the age of 14, I was singing in a folk group with my sister and a friend of ours, all from Putney High School. And we went on the radio and did folk song cellar with people like Robin Hall and Jimmy McGregor. But the thing was that my parents knew that we were out gigging a lot, so they got used to the idea of their 15-year-old daughter going out with her older sister to whatever. It might have been the Beatles at Hammersmith Odeon or a folk club where we would perform.
When I was 15, I'm not sure I've even had my first spot. I know Kev was sort of kicking her and looking like a
Well, I was doing graffiti.
Kid.
I was doing graffiti on walls at 15 and learning to DJ. A little rebel. I wasn't nicking paint or anything like that, and I was painting derelict buildings, not trains. But
you two were so cool, you see.
Well, I suppose it seamlessly slipped into being about psychedelia, because what you have to remember about the 60s, that folk music was absolutely applauded and adored. And some of those scales that you hear in folk music were starting to be used by the Beatles and others. So folk music wasn't so far away from hippiedom. And if you went to folk clubs, you got International Times, picked it up there. Ooh, what's on here? First Free Listings magazine. I need to say, it was so different then. It was absolutely, we didn't have mobile phones. We didn't have social media. What you had was this paper that had free listings. Now, if you imagine you wanted to go see a friend on the other side of London, me in Putney, friend in Hackney, how did you find out if they had no phone? How did you find out? You had to get on the bus. You get on 2 buses. You get to their house, they wouldn't be there. So communication was so much more tricky in those days. And so when you had a magazine that said, well, on this day we'll all be there, it's all about we'll all be there. So
Kev, you've been digging deep into the archives of IT and Oz and stuff, haven't you? I mean, that's an interesting thought, isn't it? The first sort of social media in a way.
Yeah, in a lot of ways. And there was a thing at Middle Earth, wasn't it? They had a stall with IT, which was, they kicked it out or something.
It didn't stay hippie in the true sense of hippie for very long. It got commercialised.
They didn't
quickly.
understand that this was basically the lifeline of the underground. But going back to UFO, I mean, just describe it, because I think you went to the first one.
I went to the first
Christmas
one, yes.
66.
That was 23rd of December 1966. I didn't go to the party prior to that was on the Roundhouse, but I went to the first one, and I remember painting my legs with daisies. So painting on body parts must have been in by then. But it was,
flowers were very much a cultural icon already.
Well, just about, yes, they were, I suppose. And I mean, there's a whole thing about, there's this terrible cliche about the 60s, which is everything was monochrome, and then suddenly you got to the 67 and then everything was multicoloured. But unfortunately, it's true. It really did feel like that. And I mean, why was UFO different? I was trying to think about how the other clubs weren't the same. There was Tiles, which was sort of connected a bit to UFO through Jeff Dexter, but there was the Marquee, the Eel Pie Island, people dressed in stay-pressed trousers. It was modish. I remember people in button-down shirts, but it was all terribly straight, and you danced through the numbers. So it was all predictable. But when you got to UFO, and from the very beginning, it was absolutely wild. And so the first thing was a nightclub that didn't sell booze. Now, quite unusual, that, wouldn't you think? So you queued up at the bar for orange pop. And you might be queuing next to Jimi Hendrix. Well, for a 15-year-old, can you imagine how that felt? And then around the corner, you're dancing with Pete Townsend. And, Eric Clapton's over there. Did you see? You're not allowed to look. You're not allowed to notice, because you have to be cool when you're around these people. So therefore, for me, that was absolutely wonderful. But it was very different in that it didn't have booze. People were smoking surreptitious joints. Maybe you'd see someone on an acid trip, but the fact that there was no booze made it a very different type of place. That there were other things that were different, like, for example, Pink Floyd, Soft Machine, Arthur Brown, all these bands, they played differently because their sets went on for 40 minutes or so. One single number would be 40 minutes. So you could be dancing, you'd explore the whole space, you'd do the kind of, not the sort of jerky, old-fashioned style dancing we'd been used to, but it was anything goes. And then with clothes, they were all different. People wore costumes. It was a bit like a fancy dress show. People would wear headdresses. People would wear paper dresses. If you didn't have money, and I didn't have much money, you bought all your clothes from jumble sales, which were crepe de chine, 40s numbers. I sewed my UFO dress, because I wore the same dress for probably about 6 months for UFO. It was a utility, the utility logo from the war with 2 semicircles. It was one of those. And I'd hemmed it during double chemistry. So I had this dress, and that was cheap as chips, you didn't. Yeah.
You had the light shows as well, Mark Boyle and people like that doing light.
There were tons. There was Joe Gannon. Mark Boyle wasn't the only one.
Because I think it's important to remember that UFO was in this basement on the Tottenham Court Road, right? Just up the road,
Club.
The Blarney Club. Not a very unprepossessing place itself, right? And it was transformed, right, by these light shows and by the things that were going on in there.
Definitely wasn't. The place was pretty grim, put it that way.
And I also wanted to say what you're saying about, like, the bands playing one song or piece that went on for 40 minutes. Pete Jenner said that, previous to that, bands would go on these kind of tours, 3 or 4 bands on a tour, and they'd play that. Their whole set would be like 25 minutes. And then
really?
Pink Floyd had gone on tour around the UK, and they were allowed to play 25 minutes, and then the next band came on. And then suddenly they had a place like that where they could just play,
let go,
just improvise and just keep going, right? So it must have been a totally different vibe.
I don't remember at other clubs, but at UFO, between bands, it was silent. So what did you do? You talked. We were all talking about this new revolution. We thought we were in a revolution. And so everyone got to know each other, which you wouldn't in a normal nightclub. And there were things like improvised poetry. But then there was this amazing thing that was very true to the Flower Children, which was this mix of high culture, highbrow versus lowbrow. So you'd have a film on at UFO, which would be The Incredible Shrinking Man. So you get smaller and smaller and smaller. And then the next moment you'll see Kurosawa with some sort of high Rashomon, or you'd have Bach, and then some sort of Disney song, cheap Disney song. The thing about the counterculture, it absolutely adored this mix of highbrow and lowbrow, and even the artist Richard Hamilton, the pop artist, he went on a CND march with a life-size cardboard cutout of Marilyn Monroe, just so that he could mix the highbrow and the lowbrow. So, I mean, there was lots of experimentation, which made it different from a nightclub. And that's where the Exploding Galaxy was born, because in there was David Medalla, this kinetic artist known for his bubble machines, doing mudras. Now, no one did mudras.
What's a mudra? I don't know.
A mudra is an Indian hand gesture, part of Indian dancing. They have the stamping but mudras tell a story. When you're trying to tell a story in Indian mythology, you use your hands to show the things that are happening, so it aids the story. Well, he was doing mudras down in UFO and gathered people around him and said, I want to start a ballet troupe. So but it was strange, because what started as a ballet troupe, sort of amateur ballet troupe, you'd say, turned into a humanoid artwork, is how I describe it. Because after the month's wait, but the big change was that the Bird Ballet, I really saw differences there. What went on stage was someone might struggle across the stage with layers and layers of clothes, or drag a chair across the stage, and it was like looking at a kinetic sculpture. So it had broken down the barriers between theatre and kinetic sculpture.
Let's have a little sidebar here. So David Medalla, painter, poet, sculptor, dancer, performer, born in Manila, right?
Yes, Filipino.
Very good looking.
Yes, adored by everybody, and he was just a presence in 66 in the mid-60s in London.
Kev mentioned earlier the Signals Experimental Gallery.
That was David and who?
Paul Keeler. Paul Keeler owned 99 Bulls Pond Road, and he had managed to get the lease of Signals Gallery from his father, who ran Keeler Optics in Wigmore Street. And that area, there are a lot of optical shops and chemists, but there are also a lot of art galleries. So it switched very nicely. It had some time to run on the lease, and he said, "Can I use this for an art gallery?" Of course, there were two galleries at that time that were really popular. One was Indica, which I remember associating that with the Yoko Ono, but the other one was Signals, and people would fly in from New York to go and see their openings. They were so much the cutting edge. And it's just such a terrible pity that when that gallery closed down, you couldn't give away the artworks. Of course, now they're worth hundreds and hundreds of thousands of pounds.
But the thing with that was that they were terrible businessmen, weren't they? They were great socialites, and they could get people into the gallery, but they couldn't sell. And this brings me on to another thing another assertion in your book is that a good proportion of the people in UFO were public school educated, and it was a very, very middle class to upper middle class.
It was very
world.
privileged.
It
was.
Yeah.
You get. I mean, it wasn't entirely like that, but it was pretty significantly like that. I mean, you did have the odd Grover, people from Notting Hill Gate. They called them the Grovers. You did have people from London Free School, but on the whole, people were had been to public school.
Pete Jenner. Pete went to public school, I think. And,
oh, did he?
Yeah, for sure. And he said exactly the same thing. This very small group of people, a lot of them have been to public school and Cambridge and university, right? And I remember he said that some of them had this sort of sense of mission, that they were there to sort of educate the lower classes.
Yes, terribly didactic.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely, and very smug. I mean, I cringe at some of the things I heard. But if you take Balls Pond Road, which was pretty squalid, it didn't have the electricity, you know, it did have water, thank goodness, but it was a pretty rough place to live. But if you think of public school boys, you know, in their prep, where they have to break the ice to wash their face in the morning, you know, they used to educate children,
character building,
to be able to rule the empire, you know.
Before we go on, let's do a bit more biography here, because Aisling, you're from Putney, a posh part of London, right, as well.
Yes.
So you're a folk singer, you know, at a very early age. You're going out with your sister playing gigs, so your parents are like, well, yeah, that's okay, but you were actually starting to go to UFO.
I wouldn't have been as tolerant, and I don't think I was as a parent as tolerant as they were. I was much more sort of trying to watch what was happening, but
you're still getting your homework.
Well, I'd been out on all night Friday night. It wasn't very good for my homework, but it was very good for my education. I was so well educated in the Exploding Galaxy. I mean, it's really, you know, speaks for alternative types of education, because that house, for all its squalor, for all its kind of freezing winter temperatures and all of that, it was full of books and artworks. And if you went, I would take a book off the shelf and it'd say Baudelaire on Poe, and I'd say, oh, I didn't know Baudelaire had written a book on Poe, and I knew nothing about Poe and nothing about Baudelaire. But then I went on to read all about Poe, adored Edgar Allan Poe, and then I found out that from this Baudelaire book that he lived in Stoke Newington.
So before we started digging into what they had on the bookshelf, you'd gone to UFO. David Medell was there. He decided to set up this thing called the Exploding Galaxy.
Yes.
So what happened next? How did you get involved, and how did it start in this house in Balls Pond Road?
It was at UFO that David was talking about starting this group, and he invited us. So I went over once to the house. Then there was Carol Grimes, the singer Carol Grimes, who at that time was living with her husband, Larry Smart, and he was a painter, so we all went. We used to do rehearsals.
Weren't they explorations, weren't they?
Well, they get later on. Once Gerald Fitzgerald comes in, it's all about exploration, activation, and the whole lot of secret language of the Exploding Galaxy. The main thing was we were getting ready for a performance at the 14-hour Technicolour Dream. So I would go along, you know, this would be weekend. I was a weekend hippie. I wasn't every day.
So you're in Putney during the week at school, then at the weekend you go up to Dalston to Balls Pond Road.
Yeah, and so we prepared for this 14-hour Technicolour Dream, and I remember a shawl and a pineapple. I don't remember much in the way of effort.
You can go a long way with a shawl and a pineapple.
There were probably a few joints in the room.
The 14-hour Technicolour Dream.
The organisers of this country's first major psychedelic event chose May Day Eve for their all-night ritual and Alexandra Palace as their temple. They offered the Queen and the Prime Minister free admission and charged 7,000 other people £1 a head.
The 14-hour Technicolour Dream was a concert held in the Great Hall of Alexandra Palace, a rather grand venue in North London, on the 29th of April 1967. It was a fundraiser for the underground countercultural newspaper International Times, which at that time was in trouble after various police raids and was being subject to an obscenity trial.
Performers like the Exploding Galaxy Ballet Company gave their services free. This work, extemporized for the event, is called the Fuzz Death Ballet. In the language of the underground, the words of groovy people, fuzz means authority, especially the police. The aim of this country's...
The concert was organised mainly by Barry Miles, who we're going to hear from in a future episode of The Bureau, and the late John Hoppy Hopkins, a pivotal figure in the underground, and various others. The event was a spectacular psychedelic carnival of music, art and theatre, with various stages, including a small one for poets, performance artists, jugglers, dancers. There were light shows in every corner, with films projected on white sheets that were taped to scaffolding, and there was a helter-skelter, which was brought in especially for the night. There was a massive array of bands playing three at once: Pink Floyd, Arthur Brown, Soft Machine, The Move, Tomorrow, The Pretty Things, Pete Townsend, Alexis Corner, The Social Deviants, The Purple Gang, Graham Bond, Ginger Johnson and his African Congo drummer. Also, performance poets Ron Geeson and Mike Horowitz, and a certain Yoko Ono, there with her performance piece, A Pretty Girl is Like a Manifesto. Seemed a bit dodgy to me. It seemed to involve inviting various people, mainly men, to snip clothes off a girl with a pair of scissors. But it was witnessed by a certain John Lennon.
They call the poetry, the music, the pattern, sculpture and films, the whole artistic output of the beautiful people, the work of the underground. Psychedelic is their favourite word. It means increased perception. It also means what happens when you take LSD and other drugs.
The Technicolour Dream was the subject of a BBC documentary. 3 film crews and their reporters attended the concert. Here is countercultural figure Jim Haynes telling the interviewer why they're doing it.
What would you describe as the purpose of this evening, the 14-hour Technicolour Dream?
I think that there's a new period. We're starting a new era, sweeping around as a kind of reaction to various things that have been happening in the world. And it makes itself manifest itself in love and sweetness and kindness and flowers and and so we're not initiating anything so much as portraying what is happening.
What emotionally do you expect to do for everybody here tonight?
It's just in a way, a kind of giant communion in a way. I don't know what out of the event itself what we expect to get, other than people meeting each other and talking to each other and touching each other.
Why the emphasis on touching all the time?
Words are not effective, but the best way to finally bring about any kind of human contact is actually physically to touch someone.
Would you say that you were, as the Californian people do, would you say that you were beautiful people?
Oh, I think so. I think people are concerned with beauty and colors and flowers and nature, and I think there is a kind of aesthetic sense about the whole movement.
Feel the way that you do?
Oh, I hope so, yes.
Larry Smart technically named the exploding galaxy, didn't he? His painting.
The adverts for the 14-hour Technicolour Dream had all gone out. They were there, and no exploding galaxy on there because we hadn't got a name yet. So someone looked at that painting and said, "What's that painting called?" The Exploding Galaxy. Okay, we've got our name. So it's thanks to Larry Smart we got our name. But there were so many people who wanted to perform and were offering that they had to have two stages. It was extremely noisy.
It was a problem, wasn't it? There was basically a sound clash in the middle.
That's it.
And it was very, very unorganised. I don't know how many people on the bill, 30 or something, artists?
Far too many for the time. What is funny is how people remember back to that time with rose-tinted spectacles. They they see it as everything's sprinkled with fairy dust, and it wasn't like that. I remember exactly what it was. People were freezing. They couldn't. The UFO had a sprung floor made of wood, so you could lie on that quite comfortably. This was this was concrete, I think, or rubble. But anyway, it was pretty chaotic, and it was what I call hippie ineptitude, really. At work.
But you went to sleep under the stage, is that right,
yeah.
At one stage?
Well, there was a lot of revising to do, so you had to combine being a school child with being a hippie, with a flower child. Yes, exactly. So I know somebody was studying Winter's Tale and the Wasteland. So that was the revision. We found a cupboard under this amazing organ. Have you seen the organ? It's absolutely giant. People were climbing up it. It was so dangerous on LSD trips. But we were underneath it, locked away. We found a cupboard where we could keep warm and do some revision. So for about 3 hours of that evening, we were there.
What did you do at the 14-hour Technicolour? I revised for my mocks.
Keeping your options open.
Yeah, exactly.
Always good to have a plan B, isn't it? But hold on a second, because it has passed into countercultural legend. I mean, it was the last time Syd Barrett played with the Pink Floyd. Already by that time he was completely gone.
But it totally failed, didn't it? Because they lost money, because they gave loads of tickets away. Tons of people didn't pay for the tickets that they were given.
Yes, they never paid in the end. One thing Hoppy did say was, no, we never paid that bill. For me, in a way, it marked the end of the Summer of Love, although we hadn't even got past April yet.
But what were the Exploding Galaxy doing there? And describe what you were doing and with who. So you've been rehearsing or talking about it at least, and then you actually get there. What do you do?
We did something called the Ballet of the Fuzz Death. And our initial ballets tended to be very stylised, oversimplified narratives about good versus evil. So the good would be the flower children under the magic mushroom being nice to each other. And then along came the police, the secret police and the archbishop and anyone you can think of in authority who were going to suppress us. And then we are absolutely, crushed, but we start chanting, turn on, and we restore the world to peace. I mean, it was so naive and all of that, but it was very popular. We went down a storm with it, even though we hadn't rehearsed, because everyone agreed with us.
No veiled metaphors.
Preaching to the choir there, aren't you?
Kev, you fancy that one, Kev, do you?
I do.
One of your shows?
I do. I think I'll have a bit of that. But
well, here's your leader, Jill, of the Exploding Galaxy, David Medalla, explaining to a curious BBC interviewer how it had all gone.
Significance of your dancing with those rings on your legs and in your underpants?
Well, some of them are I got them from an South American Indian tribe. The circles mean the exits and entrances of the soul, of the spirit, and the stripes mean that these are the boundaries between the material and the immaterial. And,
do you think you got your message across?
I think so. I think a lot of people understood that. Incidentally, we only started forming this company last Tuesday. We had no rehearsal whatsoever. It was completely a free expression thing, and we intend to play in the streets of London, and we have a dive-in ballet in the Thames. We're trying to construct our own homemade submarine, and we hope to do that in summertime.
Well, that BBC documentary alarmed the older generation who watched it, as it probably was meant to, and of course thrilled the younger generation who wanted to get some of that. But Kev, the establishment did sort of try and crack down, didn't it? Worried by all these crazy goings on.
It's interesting where the suppression and things like that played out later, didn't it? In that it seemed that the police and the media were in cahoots once they kind of got hold of the Exploding Galaxy and the countercultural movement, in that they would be feeding each other information, in turn to get a story from a bust from B, shall we say? Yes,
very much. Now, for example, the Redlands bust of Jagger and the Rolling Stones, that was definitely the police there at the same time, so the press could get the scoop, and they were arm in arm. And certainly for the Galaxy, they seem to be working as an absolute pair, and we get these articles of, this is typical: free love, free lodging, free sex, and you pay.
Sounds like the Daily Mail, doesn't it? It's never.
No, it's not. It's not.
It was the people.
It was the people. But what's interesting about this is this happened. It was good that we're talking about it now. This happened after Ali Pali. Why? Because in 1967, I think it was 17th of May, be watching Man Alive, and the programme was all about what is happening. And after that programme, the whole thing burst open. It became commercialised. All these clothes that we'd concocted for ourselves that were bright and colourful were being sold on the high street. So nothing, and then, in terms of 14-Hour Technicolour Dream, lots of people had made a killing out of that, but not the hippies themselves. So, yeah, it was very much at this moment when the television got interested in the hippies, at that point it became quite ugly, and the press went bananas. They used to show pictures of people shooting up. It had nothing to do. No one had been shooting up. It was just something they'd slung in to make people more afraid. So your average parents were very afraid of what, these vice dens like Balls Pond Road, but it said, "So help me, here's another bunch of scruffy, long-haired, unwashed washouts who believe they have solved all life's problems. With callous conceit, they reject all the rules which ordinary people live by and are busy setting up groups where everything will be common property, and I do mean everything. In Britain today, there should be little sympathy and even less help for these scruffy layabouts who have their heads in the clouds and their hands in our pocket."
But the police would bust the clubs, weren't they? Did UFO have to move to Roundhouse because of the busts?
Yeah, well, I think my memory isn't brilliant on this, but I know that they had to move from the Blarney Club because the police said, "We will get rid of your licence if you don't." So that was a threat. The other thing the police did, they used to encourage locals to be horrified and disgusted by these vice dens. And I think they said that there had been a child was being inappropriately, it was actually a child's birthday party, but they said it was paedophiles. So you had half the Covent Garden market going in and bashing down the doors. But I remember there was a bust at Middle Earth. There was also, they had a trick. The trick was a pre-plant. Now, if you were going to pre-plant someone, you'd go in on a pretext the day before, looking kind of casual, probably had long hair, and you'd find something like a cloakroom where there were lots of coats and things. So you could stick in some hash there. And at the arts lab, someone noticed someone going in a little corner of the place and thought, "This looks odd." Went there after they'd left, found a great lump of hash, and put it in a dustbin outside, got rid of it. Jim Haynes had gone to the police saying, "I don't want to be busted, because if you owned the property, if you had the lease of the property, you went to prison or you were in big trouble. It wasn't like, if someone in your premises had done it, it was your fault too." But that didn't stop them trying to do that.
So you've got two things going on at once, there, haven't you? You've got like the usual kind of establishment reaction. Always been scared of youth culture, always, still is. And then you've got simultaneously the advertisers and the fashion people are taking it up and reselling it. It's always the same.
Disarm.
It's always the same.
How do you disarm a movement? You make it
commercial.
Commercial.
Yeah.
So it was completely that, definitely.
Of course, Danny the drug dealer's famous speech in Withnail and I, "The greatest decade in the history of mankind's coming to an end, and we have failed to paint it black. They're selling hippie wigs in Woolworths."
They're selling hippie wigs in Woolworths. Well, that really was how it was. It was by 67, the summer of 67, it was almost like that. So it was an almost instant sort of commercial pouncing on the idea, because what is hippie? It's ideas about colours, ideas about where you live. Well, I don't like using the word hippie because we never used it ourselves. But
what
it's
did
just
you use?
We used flower children, beautiful people, heads, people who are heads, freaks, people who are we like the word strange very much.
People are strange, yeah.
Yeah, people are strange when you're a stranger and all that. So you can steal ideas.
Before it all went, a bit sour, I mean, you guys with Exploding Galaxy were, we've already heard one of your performances, quite idealistic. Let me read this. This is you speaking, okay? "The fact is, we saw the whole of life as an artistic exploration, and it was not about creating a product with permanence. Like many in the mid-60s, we believed anybody and everybody was potentially an artist." So that was quite lovely, isn't it? We were talking about that earlier. And I mean, also, one of the things that you were doing was this, that you were doing art in the streets, public places,
yes,
right? Housing estates, Parliament Hill, right?
Yeah.
Engaging the public was a very big thing of what the Galaxy was doing. So going out to a park and doing a performance there, or Mike Chapman.
He's a poet, right?
He was a stand-up poet in the 60s, and then he went on to become a painter, and he's now living in Brazil. But he was I seem to remember a couple of times he went to read poetry for John Peel, and we all trooped in after him. I was terribly impressed with him. I mean, he was a sort of larger than life, and he would go out like a commuter into the streets and start reading his poems, or he'd pick up a piece of rope and he'd start trying to interact with people. What else could be? How else could we use this? And people actually, it's funny, they all look like something out of Call the Midwife, but they're all joining in. They really loved it.
But there's photos in the book of you doing performances on Parliament Hill. And there's huge crowds, all smiling, laughing, watching with children.
Yes.
You know, as if it's like a sort of summer fair or something.
Yes, it did have a big draw, that one.
And tell us about scrudging as well. What's scrudging?
Well, scrudging was scavenging or foraging, going back to a time which was so totally different from anything we know now. When you walked through Islington or Hackney, you would be listening to activity, work. People were actually making things. So if it was a little jewellery workshop in Dalston, or somewhere where they were making, I don't know, clothing or dressing gowns or something, it's all there. In 67, it's all, you can hear banging as you're walking around the street because everyone's working. It's amazing.
But also it's post-war, right? So there's some, rubble and bomb sites still. And
absolutely everywhere, and one of the Galaxy members who came from America, John Duggar, he said he couldn't believe all the holes and the bomb holes and the fireplaces sticking up halfway up a building. The bomb damage was definitely there 20 however many years after the war.
So you'd go out roaming around, picking things up, turning them into art pieces or using them in performances?
Yes.
Taking the art out of the galleries, taking the performances out of the theatres?
Why not? Because the gallery that was showing all this amazing art had gone under. So, what else was there to completely turn it? The commercial art world was pretty sick. And what would you do? Well, would you take it all out to the streets? It wasn't one person's idea. It was a collective idea. Everything that you could describe that we championed at that time was what everyone felt. So it was like the sort of mushrooms growing up in lots of places. No one could say, oh, well, plastic, inflatables, they were my idea. They were everybody, because there were about 4 people working on it at the same time. So it was a real creative
collaborative
time. Yeah.
Kev, you mentioned earlier you were a bit of a street artist, weren't you, in graffiti, and there's something about that, isn't it? It's ephemeral. You might do a wonderful tag or picture or whatever you call it, and then a week later someone's gone over it.
Someone's painted over it.
But you don't mind that.
It's the nature of the art. It's public, and the nature is it's transient. It doesn't last unless you take a photo of it. But it can't be shown in art galleries. And what's interesting about the Galaxy and your book is that there isn't much evidence left of what you did, because it was so ephemeral and you weren't interested in actually keeping it for posterity, shall we say.
That's a very good point. I mean, a perfect example of that is the bakery raid. We found this defunct bakery accessory factory. It was an empty building except for the remains of what had been a business there. So those little cupcake cups, the wrinkly cupcake cups, and the sashes that you put round a cake with sparkles on them, and we just sort of covered ourselves with it. I mean, I didn't actually go on that day. I'm really sorry I didn't. I was terrified of being thought of someone who'd go in and steal anything. I was Mrs. Prim and Proper. But I did enjoy the stuff when it got back to the house. And luckily there is, in the book, there is quite a lot of documentary evidence from me of those works. In a lot of primitive art, you do patterns with dust and sand, different colour sands, and those are ephemeral. They're meant to disappear.
What was life like in 99 Balls Pond Road? I know you were only there at the weekend, but it was a commune effectively, wasn't it? So who was living there? How many people were living there? How did you eat, pay for it, you know, what were the loos like? I like all these details.
Oh, the loos, you don't want to go there.
Did you ever live there full time, or was it just weekends?
No, I would stay the weekend and then
Go home for a
I'd go
bath.
home and have my bath. It was very cold and very empty, and the first thing you'd see is the floors were covered in candle wax because there was no electricity. Everything was done with candles. We did have heating, but it was those sort of oil stoves that you had. I mean, it was pretty scruffy, but it was made into a galactic artwork by the people who lived there. Now, you said how many were living there. Well, Paul Keeler told me that he counted 60 people there one day. But that was in the early days. He had to take control of it, and he had to make sure there was going to be no drugs there.
Yeah.
So by July, it quietened down. But I would say there would be about 9 or 10 people, maybe 12 people living there.
All cooking together and...
Well, no, it was slightly less communal than that. You would get someone, John would go and do a Sunday lunch. You'd go and do that for everybody, and it would all be for everybody.
And you'd forage from the local markets and
We'd
things like
forage from the local market. If it just dropped on the ground, you could take it. So we'd get all these old Brussels sprouts and onions and things that were half damaged. So we could get the other half, and you could eat that way. So we had what we called Kingsland stew, which was
from the Kingsland Road.
Yeah.
There was a lot of secrecy about things you really treasured, like somebody had kept their marmalade in a box in their room. And I thought that's really like the Regency period, where people did keep their food in boxes because, you know...
I just love the fact that the communal spirit has got to end somewhere, isn't it? And it ended at my jar of marmalade, because you don't want to come down in the morning and someone's eating your marmalade, right? I'm a bit OCD. I couldn't do this commune thing.
I couldn't either.
No, I don't think anyone
But you
could.
said things would go missing, wouldn't they? And people would stash things, and then, you know, the sort of utopian dream doesn't work for that long.
It doesn't work for people like me who got really nice... boots for Kurt Geiger boots for a birthday present. That doesn't work. You go there and they're gone in 5 seconds.
Yeah.
But there were specific people, I think, who were doing the thieving. I won't name them. But generally speaking, the good outweighed. You know, there were all sorts of things you could criticise: ineptitude, squalor, selfishness. But there was something that made us want to go back.
Well, also,
so
there was youth spirit, optimism, idealistic...
Belief in the new future.
Belief in the age of Aquarius. And of course, you were doing stuff. You were going out into the streets. You were doing performances. You did another big thing at the Roundhouse, right?
Well, I consider the Bird Ballet to be interesting because, for me, it was the moment at which... what was being produced by the Galaxy was less sort of a ballet about good and evil, and more like going into a gallery and looking at an artwork unfolding. And these costumes were pretty amazing. Some of the costumes, theatrical run at the Roundhouse was in 1967, in October 1967, with the Exploding Galaxy.
And the Roundhouse performance was the UFO, wasn't it? It was the final sort of hurrah of the UFO at the Roundhouse.
Yes, I never went to not once to UFO after it had left Blarney.
There were several raids on Balls Pond Road where the police
number of them
tried to plant.
They tried to plant us at a school where we rehearsed, and they accidentally planted a teacher. So they couldn't do anything about that because they didn't know whose bag was whose. So they then sent someone the night before their raid.
At Balls Pond Road?
Yes, in the cellar. Then they planted something in the middle, and they seemed to be looking for the ringleaders. Well, David Medalla was in Paris, couldn't get back into England. Paul Keeler was out in the countryside trying to get help for the first raid, get support with his connections. So he wasn't there. So the only sort of senior person they could find was Gerald Fitzgerald, and they slipped some under his bed. And then in the upstairs room, Christian, they went to a shelf, immediately picked out of this wall of books, they picked out an envelope from the British Museum, found a little bit of dropsy in it, and Christian grabbed at the lump and made to throw it out the window. But he couldn't open the window, so he threw it back over his head. His girlfriend, Audrey, picked it up between her toes and hobbled downstairs with his cannabis between her toes, and then dropped it into the loo, asked if she could use the loo and dropped it in. But, I don't remember what the result of that case was.
Why? I mean, they were planting drugs on people. Why? I mean, and then arresting them for what purposes?
You could say they just saw us as a menace. I mean, it's extraordinary when they had so many other things to do. I mean, if you think of the criminal gangs around Soho, it's easy to get a hippie, isn't it? Pick up a hippie.
Or a pop star.
Yes. And they, that was, it's a good question that. Why did they do it? One of the reasons was because there was not enough protection of individuals. We know now that it's still not up to scratch, but you have to permanently work at it to stop police corruption. You could go and sit in the cell, your police officer go and sit in the cell and say, which would you like? Would you like a lump of cannabis and we'll charge you with possession, or would you like a jemmy and we can charge you with going equipped to steal? That's how bad it was. And by the 90s, they had to tape interview. You couldn't just go down to the cell and have a nicey-nicey with the accused. There were a number of things that came in with pace. It was the Police and Criminal Evidence Act did make a difference.
I suppose so. If there's an outcry against this hippie, this hippie tide, as the press would call it, and the people feel threatened by it, then the police need to be seen to be arresting people and doing stuff right. Yeah. Okay, so things are starting to get a bit darker and a bit more difficult. People are getting arrested, and there's been raids on 99 Balls Pond Road, and then but at the same time, you're doing stuff in London, you're out in the streets, doing stuff at the Roundhouse. And it was a very brief time, isn't it? And so just take us through the end of the exploding galaxy. Why did it explode completely?
The start of the kind of disintegration was the police raids, because people actually were very frightened to live there. They thought that there was no protection from police corruption. And so a whole group of people came to live with my parents for a bit. My lovely parents are sweethearts, they put up with it. But so that was definitely a reason why people were less keen to live there. And eventually the house was sold by Paul Keeler. That we went on tour. I didn't go.
Slightly too young.
Yeah, I mean, it's just as well,
Yeah, because you went to the continent, didn't you? You went to Amsterdam, the Exploding Galaxy went to Utrecht, Paris, Amsterdam to do performances. There was a film, wasn't there, that was made with some of the members.
Yes.
The demise, really, the sort of fragmentation of the galaxy started in Paris, didn't it? Reading your book, the rich French patron, Sylvina
Boissonnas. She was an extremely wealthy Parisian heiress. Their family, they had invented a widget for extracting oil, and every sort of gallon of oil that was extracted meant money for the family. And she started giving her money away in about the end of '68. And she was initially just giving it to people who wanted to make a film.
Exploding Galaxy right in Paris, and then they meet this rich French heiress who's unloading huge amounts of money on random hippies.
Well, the revolutionaries in Paris wanted to take as much money as possible out of France. I mean, they nearly did topple the government, and that's partly maybe why the police were interested in the Exploding Galaxy. Of course, we weren't remotely political. I think that might have egged on people to try and, crush us a bit more.
But she gave large amounts of money to particular members of the galaxy.
Group. Started off as making films, and then she gave £50,000. She gave to Mike Chapman to set up a printing press. It was called L'Idiot International, the International Idiot. And that was his paper, but he got ripped off. Well, he certainly didn't manage to hang on to the money.
And word got round, didn't it? And more people started going over for more handouts.
Anyone.
And even with the most tenuous connection to the Exploding Galaxy.
No connection whatsoever. They just had to say we were Exploding Galaxy. And of course she got wise to that and she stopped. But David Medalla went with a troupe of Galaxy people off to India to see called Kathakali dancers. One person went to South America. Other people went to other parts of the world.
So it basically started to, as things do, and it was creating ephemeral art anyway, so it started to break up itself, and
Yes.
people went on to do other things, including you, right? So
Yes.
it was a particular time, and by this time you're only 16, 17, right?
Yeah, I suppose. Yeah, I wanted to get into theatre and dance, so I spent some time at the Place. I was particularly close to one of the kinetic artists who was Elio de Sica. So I got very much involved when his exhibition was put on at the Whitechapel, and I became friends with him. And so I went off to Brazil at one point.
Because you had links with the Tropicalists, didn't you?
Yes,
who came to London
yes,
in the 60s.
Yes, their connection was Elio de Sica, because he had invented the term tropicalia, and Caetano Veloso, the singer, had been told you should really look at what Elio's doing. Caetano used the word tropicalia, but it was a similar movement actually to what was happening in London in the 60s, the tropicalia movement.
And the other members of the Exploding Galaxy went off to doing their own things, and some of them still alive and still doing stuff. You mentioned Mike Chapman, and it was one of those things, wasn't it? I mean, and I think Kev's final question. Well, I should ask it, Kev. I mean, about looking back. This, by the way, Jill's book, which we mentioned already, and coming out in a new edition soon. What was it about the book that you loved so much?
Well, I love the women's perspective, really, and that's probably something for another podcast another time. There haven't been too many accounts written like that, and you do touch on a lot of different things, especially the sexual revolution in inverted commas, and the woman's place in that. Unfortunately, you didn't have the greatest, not you personally, but women didn't have the greatest time.
The person I would think particularly of is Carol Grimes, saying, oh no, there I was, not making meat and two veg, I was making brown rice, and they were all sitting in the full lotus position snapping their fingers.
My final question is that who's living at 99 Balls Pond Road today?
I have been past. What I notice is it's got a burglar alarm, so it's gone up market. I tell you what, it was divided after it was sold. It was divided into 2 flats. It's now not one house. But I think when I saw an advert for one of the flats for sale, it said "Notorious Home of the Exploding Galaxy."
Wow!
Yeah, we need some sort of psychedelic plaques, don't we?
Yeah.
They've got the blue plaque for all the kind of like Shelley lived here or Keats lived there, and you need the psychedelic version.
Yes.
Very good, Jill Drower.
Thank you very much for having me.
Kev, thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Thanks to Kev, thanks to Jill. Her book, The Exploding Galaxy, really is a trip, seen from the inside of the psychedelic scenes of late 60s London. And a lot of other stuff. As Kev pointed out, it's very, very interesting on the subject of the way that women were treated during that time. And we're going to get Jill back and another guest to talk about that subject in the future. I'm going to put links to all the things that we've talked about in this episode, of the show notes, of course. Thank you for listening and spending your countercultural time with us. Remember, you can check out all that we do at bureauoflostculture.com. Why not support our crazy endeavours? You could buy us a coffee or a Pernod or a pastis. You can sign up for our newsletter. Join us on Instagram or leave us a review somewhere or other. We'd appreciate that. We'll see you next time for more tales from the other side, from the upside down, from the underground. Our best, as ever, counterculturally yours. This episode of the Bureau of Lost Culture was sponsored by the artist known as The Real Tuesday Weld, tuesdayweld.com. Here they are with their psychedelic song, Something Beautiful, from their album, The Return of the Clerkenwell Kid.